Patrick, welcome back.
Thank you for having me. Always a pleasure.
So if anybody doesn't know, Patrick Tomaso has been on the podcast before, but it's been a little while. I feel like your YouTube life has changed a little bit in that intervening time. I feel like you're on the list of people that came on this podcast at a certain size and then exploded, not at all due to their appearance, but you've had a great year
Maybe,
or two
who knows,
since your last.
Yeah, and I did I did a pivot for anybody that isn't aware. I used to do a lot of tech and camera stuff. Not that I still am not interested in that stuff, but I saw sort of an opportunity to shift a little bit more to a broader audience that loves movies, not just the tools that make those movies. And so I've done more video essays and reviews of movies and TV shows. And the success has been spectacular. So anybody that's a fan that's watching this, please, thank you. That's awesome. Every time I post a video, I still think it's going to get 100 views. So anything that's more than that, I'm always very, very excited about.
Yeah, I mean, we're always all still in that same boat that every release is a new roll of the dice and who knows what's going to happen. But no, I mean, I do like that path that you've gone down, because I even think about, even though I'm really into this nerdy stuff, I still consume all the pop culture stuff. Like, everybody unifies around a few things, and doing a great job at covering it is super valuable. And I actually find there's still, no matter how many movie videos there are, movie podcasts, whatever, there's still only a few that I love. Like, the fact that you're doing a great job, like that you have an aesthetic taste and are not just kind of being a bit of more of an like armchair reviewer, you're a little bit more coming from a place of knowledge, I think is actually lacking. Like, there aren't enough, there's always more room. As crowded as a market seems, it's like, no, I always feel like I need more of the kinds of voices that I can relate to talking about these things. So
absolutely.
Yeah, glad you've been doing it.
The analogy that I always use, and this is maybe a Canadian thing, but in Canada, we have stores that are like dedicated for liquor, right? So we have like the LCBO in Ontario. I'm sure Calgary has their own version of it too. But when you walk into a liquor store, you see all the bottles of wine. If any one of those people said, I don't want to make wine because people already make wine, you wouldn't have all the diversity of wine that's available to the world right now. So anybody that sits at home and is like, I don't want to make a YouTube video because X amount of people have already done this, that's no way to live your life, because your perspective is what's most important, right? And you will bring something new no matter what, right?
Yeah, I love cooking, but I don't want to open a restaurant because there's already restaurants.
Yeah,
I mean, tough business to get into,
sense,
but
right?
yeah. So no, well done with it. I kind of wanted to just start off talking about last year. I mean, this is the first episode of 2023. So just kind of like look back a little bit more, even though that's what the last episode was about, but just, like what was exciting. And then we have something very new looking forward for 2023. But we'll get to that in a few minutes. So I don't know what you just said. You're not talking about cameras and tech as much, but I'm going to make you talk about them a little bit here. But like, what did you end up using a lot last year? What was sort of the cameras or the gear that kind of defined being a creator for you?
Totally. I feel like Mac Studio is still one of the best things I've had in my kit, in my arsenal. It's still the computer for me that is the one I just don't think about. It doesn't matter what I seem to throw at the Mac Studio. It just works. It's become, like most Apple products for me, it's gotten boring in the fact that it doesn't give me a hard time, which we've talked about. Sometimes you need a bit of friction in your creative process, right? You need something to push back a little bit just to get you a little bit excited. Whereas with, honestly, the 14 Pro iPhone and the Mac Studio, they've just worked so well that I'm like, maybe I need to go back to an Intel machine just to edit something on Resolve to get excited again.
I don't know if that's true,
right? I might be pushing it just a little bit, but it's like I haven't heard a fan turn on. I haven't heard anything go wrong with it. Like every time I get a new camera or a new phone, whatever it is, anytime I throw something into this, no matter how big the project, how many layers I'm throwing at this computer, it just works. And so I know a lot of people are excited for like an M2, and of course we have the M2 machines that are already out, but like an M2 Pro, and I'm sitting here being like, I still can't max this thing out. So whatever that is going to be insane. So I think as like a computer, and for me, the Mac Studio has just been absolutely stellar.
Well, so I did actually start finally maxing out my M1 Max MacBook Pro and kind of started finding the limits. And that was with Resolve. And I want to talk about that a bit more specifically in a sec about just my recent experiences in Resolve and Final Cut and stuff. But which build are you using of the Mac Studio, just for anybody that wants to replicate your success?
So I've got an M1. I guess it's the Ultra. No, the Ultra. The Ultra is the bigger one, right? The faster. I have the M1 Max, but I max out the RAM.
Max. Right.
M1 Max. Yeah. Jeez, the nomenclature on this computer.
I hate it. I will
the
never
M1
get
Max
used to this.
with 64 gigs of RAM.
Yeah, that's a pretty similar build to what my laptop would be, which they should theoretically be pretty similar performance. But then, okay, so another thing that you've been mentioning on Twitter, and I feel like we should talk about Twitter for a second too, because you
yeah, for sure. I mean, there's a lot been going on there. Yeah,
yeah, it's been busy. But so anytime I've been posting about like favorite cameras or what camera to get, your response has reliably been that the iPhone 14 Pro is just the best camera all around. And I don't want to say you're trolling, but I want to ask you, how much are you trolling, and how much do you really feel like the iPhone 14 is just the best camera for people to use?
I mean, it's still like, I just came back. I mean, we'll talk about this, but I just came back from Japan and I had every camera that I own, basically, at least the ones that I've been using frequently, right? So I had my FX30 with me. I even brought my A7IV. And on the days that I brought it out, I had an okay time. And I was very happy with the footage that I've gotten. I've been using a lot of it for Instagrams and Reels and stuff like that, just so I don't want to go to waste. But throughout the trip and towards the end of it, I said, forget it. I don't want to carry this thing anymore. I'm going to bring the phone out with me. And it was like right back to why I love that phone so much. Everything I shot with that had, and it's more a personal thing, but it had, like, subjectively for me personally, I felt like I took better photos with it. Not the quality, nothing else. I think composition, the subject, what I was looking for and how I shot was just overall better. And it always goes back to me is like, I started my photography career and all of this with an iPhone. So go back to iPhone 3G. The fact that I could take a photo and then edit it right there on a phone changed absolutely everything for me. So I don't think everyone's going to have that same universal experience. I think there's a bit of a unique situation with how I approach the phone. But for me, it's still the one that I grab the most often and get the best results out of. And it's subjectively, I think I just shoot better with that. And it's probably due to the size, the fact that I'm not carrying things around. And I'm also a bit jaded as like doing this for work. I don't like carrying my big cameras because I feel like I'm working all the time. So it's almost like a separation between what I do for clients and what I do for personal work is almost like divided by a line between here's a mirrorless and here's an iPhone, whereas this is fun and this I'm getting paid for. And so it's a bit of that as well. But that also, the quality is just freaking insane. Like, I've tested YouTube videos on my second channel where I've shot the entire talking head with it and no one ever calls out like, this looks like shit or this looks like crap, right? And I usually like to pump fake people and I don't tell them till about halfway through that I am using the phone. And they're always getting comments back. I had no idea. If you didn't tell me, I wouldn't have known, right? And so I think subjectively for like mass audiences, I have a whole thing now where like I don't like making content for filmmakers because I think we're the worst critics of absolutely everything, right? And so when I make videos, when I'm making things, I'm not thinking about people like you and I'm thinking about the masses of like, what are they really going to narrow in on and care about in this piece, be it production value or what I'm even speaking about. And so with the iPhone, I still think like 99% of people, they're totally cool with that. Like, we have nice setups right now for this right here, but when I get on a Zoom call with clients, they don't, right? They're using the studio display kind of webcam, if not worse. They're using Dell laptops and whatnot. And no one's sitting there being like, I really wish this had more depth of field and I wish it looked more cinematic, right? And so there's part of me that like feels like there's a paradigm shift of just generally speaking, we're all outside of the filmmaking community, we're all way more accepting of production value that comes from things like phones, right?
I 100% agree with you. And I feel like often I'm the one kind of arguing for that. The difference in our perspectives, I think, is that shift also frustrates me. Like, obviously, I love I love the way the iPhone takes images, that convenience. I can't argue with. Like, so often, I want to leave the bigger camera behind. You know, even though I spend all this time being so excited to acquire the big camera, and I get more excited looking at the images that come off of it. But because there's a bit of a feel, especially if you're shooting video in like a log profile, there's a feeling of like, you know, you throw a LUT on there, you like, you know, put it through your grading pipeline, and all of a sudden it's like developing film, and you kind of get that surprise of getting something back. Whereas every image on an iPhone, like I know what an iPhone photo looks like, but I still often kind of want to leave my camera behind just because it's so big. And that there's been a lot more of our client work over the last year has been on the phone. Like, there's been so much stuff that it's going to be used for social media, and most stuff on social media connects better when it looks like it's shot on a phone. Like, that's just becoming the reality. Like, that TikTok aesthetic of that, the way the exposure shifts differently on an iPhone, the way the focus, like everything about an iPhone, you can usually kind of just see it. Even if it looks great, it looks different. And I think that really does read as authentic to a lot of viewers. So we've been getting more and more jobs where we're expected to shoot on the phone. And it's just, it's left me in this bit of a like crisis moment of like everything I've been working towards and like trying to do is make things look like the movies, right? That's why I've got all these lights and I've got fancy cameras and stuff. It's like, I want to make things that look expensive and look well controlled and look like they would in the cinema. And the fact that even a lot of our client work is moving away from that is like, well, then what am I aiming for above this now? Is it just to get because the most exciting thing to me is the output of the image, less so than specific. Like I'm not as much of a storyteller, I would say, which I know is more important. But since I've been so focused on the image, now it's like, oh, well, the image doesn't matter as much. Just focus on the story. I'm like, oh crap, now I'm back to square one.
Yeah, and like for me, I think it's time and place. Like there's obviously moments where I'm like, yeah, of course I don't want to use a phone for this. Like I still think it's like if I was making a short film or a full feature or a documentary, I'm not going to use my phone. There's just too many great affordable cameras now that look fantastic that I don't think the use case scenario makes sense like it used to, where, yeah, it was amazing, maybe like iPhone 7 era, iPhone 10 kind of, where it was like, wow, we have a 4K camera and it's got such great dynamic range, and mirrorless was a little bit more expensive at the time and it was a little bit out of reach, but now you could buy a camera from 3-4 years ago. You could buy a GH5 and shoot a movie with it, right? So I still think there's obviously a place for cinematic quality and it looks like a movie. My argument is I'm not entirely sure it's this. I don't know if this is where that time needs to be spent, right? And so I've been looking for areas where I can minimize the amount of things I need to set up and do all of this because everyone's okay with lower production value, right? I still think I'm over polishing even my main channel. I think I could go a little bit more scrappier there as well. And it's just, I don't know, it's a paradigm shift and I'm trying to get on the cusp of it and stay ahead of it as much as I can. And like you said, clients want it too. So I have jobs now where I bought the new DJI OM5, like the mobile gimbal and stuff, just to make it seem a little bit more professional, right? But it's a line item on my kit now. I have an iPhone 14 Pro. We can shoot in ProRes if you want. Not that anybody ever needs it, but it's something clients want. You can still get paid doing it. And it's just one more tool in the arsenal in the kit, right?
Yeah, I mean, our experience so far is with the types of clients we've worked with, the camera we're using, whether the thing is being shot on the iPhone or the C70 or whatever it is, has not actually affected the rate. I mean, it's effectively this, more or less the same thing. And I think it's going to be like that more and more in the future because, most of a production isn't actually pressing record. Most of a production is everything around. What are you shooting? What's the location? What does the person look like? What's the story? What's the edit? I mean, everything else is more significant in the end. I don't know. I still want big cameras. And I mean, I've been talking more and more about Reds too. Like I would love to have a Red camera at some point just to kind of have basically a gold standard. This is often like how I think about like why I want an expensive camera. It's not primarily that I need it for more client work, but it's that since I do all this like talking about filmmaking and stuff, I kind of want to be able to have that bar to compare it to. Like this is what it really, really should look like. And so now I have a reference point for everything else. But
I mean, you should just grab a Komodo. I don't know what you've been waiting for.
Now I'm waiting for a Komodo 2, kind of. Now I feel like I waited so long that it's like
You've looped around to like, I might as well just wait for the next one. Yeah, I'll get Mark 2.
But okay, we do have cameras to talk about today. We have specifically, actually no, 2 cameras, but mostly 1 camera. You were in Japan recently, as you've alluded to.
I was.
I missed that trip because I was in Thailand at exactly that moment. Like it was actually pretty close to that. I could have done both, but not quite. So I missed out. But this was all for the Panasonic Lumix S5II, which, if you just said that name to me, I wouldn't have been very hyped up until kind of recently. I've been getting more into Panasonic. I reviewed the GH6 last year, and I've understood more why they have this dedicated community. And you've been part of that for a longer time. You've put out a lot of videos on GH5 and the previous S5, and just like you've been using Panasonic, and that's why I wanted to talk to you. I want to get more context about from people that have already understood like why Panasonic's worth paying attention to, even though they're very much like a runner-up in terms of market share right now.
Oh, absolutely.
And let's maybe get into why or why not the S5II might be their chance to catch up a little bit.
I've always felt that Lumix has always been ahead in nearly every department, be it image quality, features, their image stabilization, just across the board. You could check it off on an Excel sheet. Everything was, a couple years ahead of all the competition, but they were always held back by this very stubborn, like latch onto contrast-based autofocus, right? And so anytime you had a Lumix camera, you were like, I have the cream of the crop for pretty much everything, but if I have to use autofocus for this thing, good luck. It was always constantly hunting. They had a really great tracking algorithm, so you could see your eye was like supposed to be in focus, but it was never actually in focus. And so a lot of us just put up with it. We put up with it because everything else about the camera was so great and at an affordable price. So they always sort of beat out everybody at the price point, and then also in features, it was just lacking in the autofocus department. So we all like tried to come up with excuses. It doesn't matter. You don't need autofocus for professional work. If you're a YouTuber, just set it manually. All this, like, I've done videos like this. Plenty of people have done videos about this. And I got to a point over the last couple of years where I couldn't make excuses anymore. As soon as Sony kind of caught up in image quality and most of the same features as well as Lumix, I was like, what am I doing here? I'm getting more into YouTube. I'm doing a lot more social media stuff. I'm trying to make my life easier when it comes to filming as well. So do I really want to keep using manual lenses and all this stuff where I'm manually focusing? I saw how good the autofocus was on these Sony cameras. And so when the A7 IV came out, I was like, look, the price seems to make sense. It seems to have all the features that I want. And I jumped ship. So I was using a Lumix S5 previous to that. And I went to the A7 IV and I've absolutely loved it. I'm using this camera right now. This is the A7 IV. And so I traded a lot of things that I love about Lumix, be it shutter angle, image stabilization. I still think Vlog is even a better log profile than S-Log3. Just a lot of just creature comforts that I liked with that camera. I gave it up just for autofocus. And I know a lot of other people that have done that as well. And so spoiler alert, the S5 Mark II has phase detect autofocus. So the prophecy has been fulfilled. The prayers have been answered. And so the question now is, does it put it on the playing field of the A7S3s, the FX3s, the Canon C70s of the world? So I guess we'll talk about that, but I have some thoughts in that area as well. But generally speaking, I've just always thought Lumix was ahead of the game in every department but autofocus.
Yeah, and well, for context, the recording sequence as well, neither of us have recorded our final review videos or anything like that. So, whatever we say here, if it doesn't sync up with that, partly we're trying to get to the point of, what are our fully fleshed out opinions on this. Because I also want to assume that most people watching and listening haven't shot with Panasonic before, because that's generally going to be true. Like, I was looking at the graph of market share the other day, and the amount that, Canon is still dominating, which is kind of wild to me, like how they're still quite a bit ahead. I'm not going to say the numbers because I'll probably get them wrong if I guess, but they're still noticeably ahead of Sony. But Sony's massively caught up and is on track to eventually surpass Canon if it keeps going. And everybody else is just miles behind. It's a pretty significant difference just in terms of how many people are actually using it. But when it comes to video specifically, Panasonic is up there still. Like, I think they had such a lead with the GH4. That's really kind of what's kept them in the running for all of this time. Like, but based on that momentum, they built a big enough fan base that community has stuck with them through the challenges of autofocus. And so, yeah, I'd like to go over some of the details. Like, what do we really mean? Like, why is Panasonic actually still interesting even without autofocus? And then we'll get to like, does it work? But what are some specific features that we both find worth, even with the previous camera, we've got the GH6 nearby, worth using the mediocre autofocus of those previous generations? Like, why was it still worth it?
Totally. I think even if you talk about the GH6, because I've always called the S5 like the GH6 that I wanted, and I still actually think that. I said that a lot in my GH6 review too. I think if you're in Micro Four Thirds, of course GH6 is fantastic, but a lot of the things, particularly when it comes to image stabilization, I'm someone that does not like shooting with gimbals. I never have. I just don't have the gene for it. I don't know what it is, but I find it robotic. I find it very constricting and restrictive when I'm filming, whereas I like to be handheld, but I like to have that float of what feels like I've built a bigger cinema rig, which is something I also don't like to do that often either. I like a small compact kit. And I've always found, because I started with Lumix, that I got really used to my aesthetic of having really good image in-body stabilization, right? And so if you pick up a GH6, a GH5, even a GH4, even a G85, a camera that you can get for like $900 now, you pick that up and then you pick up an A7S3 or an A7 IV, an FX3, it is literally night and day, right? The biggest issue I've had with my A7 IV and my FX30 is just the IBIS. It's always just a little jittery and shaky, and the sensor always feels like it's bouncing against the sides of its walls, right? It's just jerking back and forth. And so the IBIS on these cameras is absolutely stellar. I also think creature comforts like shutter angle, if you're someone who switches from 24, 30, 60, and you don't want to have to change your shutter speed every single time, you just leave that thing in 180 and you're golden. You're set to go. This is something that should be in absolutely every camera. If anybody that has a Sony, you know that you want that in your FX3, you want that in your FX30, you want that in your A7S3. Every camera that shoots video now should have a shutter angle option. And that's been in there since the GH4. I'm pretty sure even like a GH3 had shutter angle, right? And so that's another little thing where you're like, having shot with this S5 Mark II now, I've been thinking like, my God, I forgot how great it is just to have something as simple and stupid as shutter angle. It is like a quality of life thing while shooting that makes a massive difference.
And there just is a laundry list. There's a long, long list of those details that both Canon and Sony seem to just stubbornly be not acknowledging matter in their mirrorless bodies specifically. Like when it comes to the bigger cinema stuff, the C70 or C300 or the FX9 is just going to have everything, but things, well, maybe not even everything, but having like waveforms be visible properly, a vector scope built in, like full zebra control, focus peaking, focus punch-in. So when you're doing the manual focus, that it automatically creates like a box to see what you're getting. Canon doesn't do that at all. Sony does Sony? I've used Sony for a little while, so I got to catch up on
Sony will do a punch in.
details.
But another big thing with Lumix is like if you ever shot anamorphic, it's one of the nicest systems to shoot anamorphic on as well. You can de-squeeze in camera. It has every de-squeeze that you'd want. It has tailored image stabilization for anamorphic as well, which is also wonderful. They just thought of like all the micro, I almost feel like they thought about every other micro detail because they couldn't figure out autofocus. So they were like, we can't figure out autofocus. We got to make sure everything else is like top of the line. So it's almost like they threw the kitchen sink at it, but then it kind of backfired on them because the one thing that they should have threw the kitchen sink at was autofocus, right?
Yeah, totally. Well, but I feel for them because they're responding to all these little things. And actually, I want to keep going because I thought of a few more from the list.
Yeah, go for it.
48 frames per second instead of just shooting 60. Does the FX3 or 30 do that?
No 48 frames per second.
What else? And then we already said shutter angle. And then huge is full frame open gate.
Open gate, yeah, absolutely.
Just being able to actually use the full sensor that you paid money for. It's so weird to me that this has not been more widely adopted because the sensors have been this big all along, and it just seems kind of self-evident. Panasonic, I think, is using Sony sensors. I don't know. Sony could have been doing this all along. And instead they're like, no, 16:9 is fine. It's like, why would you want any ratio other than 16:9? Well, I can give you a very long list of reasons why I want a bigger aspect ratio than what I'm going to use, or something that, there is some buffer space that I'm kind of not looking at while I record, that when I get into post, I have some room to move around, some flexibility. And I don't want to go back to my 16:9 cameras. So the context, like probably what I'll talk about the most in my review is comparing it to the R5, which is my mirrorless video camera. I think the R5 has been a little bit forgotten for its video capabilities because it's just so clearly been surpassed by some of the Sony options right now. But, it wasn't that long ago that it came out, and it was very much hyped as being like, it shoots 8K, it shoots RAW, internally, like the 124K. The list of features on the R5 were really exciting for a while, and a lot of people are still using it, and the R5C. The Lumix S5II is just devastating to the R5. Like I never want to pick up my R5 instead of the Lumix. I mean, it's just superior in almost every single way. So for video, obviously, R5 is
sure.
That's still going to be my go-to photo camera. But
Totally.
I had the experience of shooting the Thailand travel video that I just made, which when you're traveling like that somewhere, there's restrictions on how much you can take with you, and you want it to look like the best video you've ever shot. I wanted to bring my C70. I wanted to bring gimbals and just like make everything perfect all the time, but I had very little weight. So I basically just used the R5. And then I was also testing the Fuji X-T5 at the same time, which, I should talk about that more here. So let's remind me to talk about the
totally.
Fuji at the end. But so most of it I shot on the R5, and the wobble in the lens, like you were just talking about, it was horrible. I didn't know. I had just picked up the 15 to 35 ahead of time, and I knew everybody complained about it. I'd seen video, like I'd kind of seen the test. I'm like, yeah, it's not great, but I don't know. I just didn't think about it too much. I just started shooting, and while I was shooting, it seems fine looking at the viewfinder, and you get it back on your computer, and I was just like, this is terrible. Like so much of this footage is unusable. So it was really disappointing. And looking at everything that I've been shooting on the S5II, I have not had that experience with anything. I've never had something where I'm like, I shouldn't have trusted the stabilization. It wasn't as good as I expected. It's like, it's, you know, it's not perfect. There can still be moments where you find jerky movements in it. But it's just so much better that now if I were to do another trip like this, I would absolutely be using the Panasonic for like a travel camera rather than the R5. Oh, and
sorry, go ahead.
Well, I want to get to this because I should have brought it up front, but I do want to disclaim too that like Panasonic had an extremely generous loan program with this. So we'll all be mentioning this in our videos, I assume, but like,
oh, for sure.
we both, and I don't know if everybody did, but got like a pretty complete lens kit of, I mean, I think I have all the primes, and a couple zooms, and like just, they really were like, look, just try this. We want you to try the system because I think this is a really important release for them. So there, I don't know if you have more clarity on it, but like basically it's just like a sort of a long-term loan. It's not, they're not giving me the camera, but it's more than I would get from other camera companies in terms of like, look, you can use it for a pretty extended amount of time. So just to disclaim that it's like often a review is like really brief, and this is like, no, just take your time with it. So, I super appreciate that in terms of being able to understand what they're trying to get to. And I honestly might have paid less attention to the camera if they were like, here, you can have it for 1 week and then send it back.
Yeah. I mean, it's a big swing, I feel like, right? I think it's smart from like a marketing perspective to make sure that, you know, all the right people have this in their hands to talk about how great it's been. There's part of it feels like I told you so from people that have already had Lumix for a while, which is nice.
You can
too.
be smart
so
about
like
it.
there's a bit of validation for the fans of the system that's going to probably happen when this camera comes out too. I would say like as an overall, and we can talk about this a little bit too, and I would love your perspective on it because you didn't have the S5 before. What I find interesting with this camera, and it's something I'm probably going to talk about in my video too, is that if you're an existing Lumix user, probably an S1, S1H, S5, you might actually be a little bit disappointed with this release because if you think about it, it really is still just the S5 with a full-size HDMI port and phase detect autofocus, which is big. Don't get me wrong, that's huge. But there's part of me that thinks like, what if this was the camera it was supposed to be when it first came out, and the Mark II would have improved on all the other areas we probably would have saw in a next generation camera, right? So things like uncropped 4K 60, which this camera's missing, right? That's starting to become one of those things why I love the FX30, even though it's Super 35. It's that when I switch from 24 to 60, I'm not getting a crop.
There's no change.
It's a consistent. Yeah, there's a big change between the APS-C mode and the full frame mode. And I often find myself switching that quite often throughout a shoot. And so it's been a bit annoying being on the A7 IV and also being on the S5 Mark II where I need to switch into 60 to shoot some B-roll. Boom, there's that 1.5x crop, right? And so I'm thinking in the back of my head, like, you know, next full frame camera that I buy, I want it to have full frame 4K 60. And we've already seen like R6 Mark II is doing that, right? And so cameras that are coming out in this generation that's moving forward have those features that I would have loved to see in an actual Mark II of an S5. So it's a little bit bittersweet for me because I already was using the S5, and I think it'd be challenging for a lot of people that already own an S5 to justify spending another $2,000 just to get autofocus. That seems kind of a little bit of a tough sell because now you have two cameras that essentially do the same thing. Just one has workable and usable autofocus. So that to me is the biggest thing that's maybe clouding over the camera for me. But everything else, if we just went through the line items of it, I just think it's a knockout, right? Especially for people that have never used Lumix before.
Well, and such a strong point that is easy to lose perspective is that all the other cameras we're going to compare this to, like everything else we're mentioning, is at least $500 more expensive, at least.
For sure.
Right?
For sure.
The Sony A7 IV is $500-600 more. The Canon R6 Mark II is at least $500 more. The R5 is double the price. The A7S III is double the price. Like $2,000 is the cheapest that you can get all this stuff for. So that, you know, it's like I don't want to apologize for features that are missing, but at the same time, like you're saving a significant amount of money with this camera. You are getting some additional features that just aren't available on anything else in this price range, including double. And so those trade-offs, it's worth remembering. Like you're also not paying more for losing things like that. Because yeah, like I totally agree that the cropping in on the 4K 60, 4K 48 is frustrating. Not because it's bad to shoot in APS-C, like it's totally fine, but like you say, it's that changing of your focal length, which, if you're using a prime, it's like, well, I wanted the shot to match what I was just shooting a second ago, and having that jump is the problem. So you either stick to APS-C or stick to full frame, but having it change that's the moment of frustration. So yeah, the price just like blows me away on this.
So my one challenge, because it comes up a lot when I've actually praised the price of the S5 in the past before, I get a lot of comments from people that look at the ecosystem, right? So if you're looking at Canon, you're looking at Sony, there is a third-party system of really, really cheap, affordable lenses that also support autofocus in the sub $400 range, right? You can Rokinons, Viltrox, Seven Artisans, all these companies are making lenses for E-mount and EF and even RF now. Whereas L-mount is in such an infancy that if you were to buy an S5, you can start to offset that cost when you're going to like an A7 IV or any Canon when you have to start buying those L-mount lenses, right? And so because we're still early in L-mount, it's a little bit of a challenge for me because all those S primes that we've been using, they're all pushing $900, right?
Yeah.
A pop, right? So it's
not, the kit is
you buy a
not
couple,
cheap.
the kit is not cheap. So that's where it sort of levels out a little bit for me price-wise, where I start to think about it like big picture. You're still in an investment phase with this. It's almost like a startup camera, right? It's like you're getting into it sort of early a little bit still, even though we've been around for a while. I do think even still the Mark II is in a little bit of that startup phase where it's like you're still investing in the future of this system, hoping that it still continues to grow and get better. Look, Sigma's a part of that L-mount alliance. Leicas a part of it as well. So you got big names that are making things for this camera. And I'm very optimistic that like the Rokinons and the Viltroxes of the world will start making more L-mount lenses. But it's something to consider right now that be wary and look at the pricing of lenses when you're shopping for this to match the focal lengths that you need because it can get pricey pretty quick.
Yeah. And I want to take some time to really praise these lenses in a second. But first, frustration is also some of the missing stuff, even at the higher end, that, I don't think there's a 16 to 35 2.8, for example. It's just an f4.
No.
There's a few like blank spots that are very standard in other lens systems and are still missing here. So, worth noting, but I also have a lot of good stuff to say about the lenses I've tried.
Yeah, no, for sure. The lenses are awesome, yeah.
Is there nothing in the Sigma range at that lower price? Like I hadn't shopped the Sigma options as much, but let's also just like emphasize that like this is a lens system shared across a few different companies, which I think is so impressive the way that they realized they're like, okay, look, none of us are at the point of really competing with Sony or Canon, so let's come together and do something, which I think is very interesting and also can adapt to EF lenses as well, which I was hoping to get a chance to test that adapter and I haven't yet. What is it? Have you shot EF lenses on Panasonic?
I haven't tested it yet on the Mark II of the S5, but I do have the Sigma MC11 for L mount, so EF to L mount. So I would play with like an 18 to 35 and stuff on it. The problem was just the autofocus was terrible. It was just nice to get the 1.8 at an 18 to 35.
But you haven't
tried it
S5II yet. Okay.
No, and it's something that I've been testing more of, like actually just narrowing in more on L-mount native lenses, like actually using Panasonic's lenses as opposed to using Sigma, because I want to give the autofocus the best shot to see what it's fully capable of. And I know that Sigma and everybody hasn't really updated their lenses for phase detect yet, so it feels like a bit of an unfair comparison at this point. That being said, like one of my first lenses for L-mount that I bought was a Sigma 24-70 because it was at least half the price of the L-mount Leica version of it, right? And so, yeah, there are Sigma versions of a lot of the contemporary lenses that we're used to, but you're also got to remember it's L-mount. So the used market isn't as broad and big yet because there hasn't been enough people buying it. And so I kind of bought that 24-70. That was like the one sort of main lens that I bought for the S5. And I sort of held off a little bit because I've been holding out. I was like, are they ever going to put proper autofocus in this camera? Because I don't want to invest too much in it. And so I bought these like appetizer cameras from Sony as like a little bit of a holdover and a stopgap. And same thought. I didn't spend too much on E-mount either because it was a lot easier to buy really cheap, affordable lenses for E-mount. And so like that gap got filled really easily because I could buy Rokinons and Viltrox and stuff just in the meantime, as opposed to, buying G Masters, right? I didn't need to, right? And so that's the interesting thing. I want to test more Sigma stuff and like EF sort of adapting with the phase detect, but for now I'm like I want to give it its best shot. Like this is fully what it's capable of because the system's probably most optimized with actual Panasonic lenses, but it'll be interesting to see how it behaves with them.
I was in that same position when I was using Sony as my main video cameras. Like the 28 2.0 was my main lens. Like I use that for most things, and there's a few other small primes that I loved Sony for. and I never committed to the big zooms. That's part of why it was like easier for me to exit the Sony ecosystem, was because like, well, I don't have that huge of a lens commitment. But now I don't know. I'd like to pick up a Sony. Like I probably would, like, kind of right away. It's only like we're in a little bit of an awkward moment of like the exact Sony I would want. Basically the A7 IV is what I'd want, and it's a little late in the life cycle, especially for somebody that reviews cameras. So I'm having this feeling like I don't know what to pick up. But yeah, I've always loved that Sony has those smaller primes. Canon does not do that. So I don't know. I want to make sure I do spend a second kind of praising these primes, which again, like they lent us, I think, the whole kit, which goes from, let's see them. So there's 18, 24, 35, 50, and 85, which by any definition, that is a complete kit of primes. It's a pretty extensive list. I mean, okay, I don't know where to start. I just have I've loved having them together. And maybe even part of my excitement is I haven't had a matching prime kit for anything before. I've only had like stray, like I'll have one of the Canon primes and one of the Sigma primes, and one of the Sony primes. But once you've got a few of these, the killer feature that they worked very hard on, I'm sure, is optimizing them all to be almost the exact same size and weight. So that means the same lens filter diameter, so that you're going to be using the exact same ND filters on the front of them. The weight doesn't shift, so as you swap them in and out on a gimbal, they all match. They all fit into the same slot in a camera bag. The only downside is that I can't tell which is which until I pick it up and stare at it. So I can put stickers on them or something. But I mean, that was such a conscious choice. That was just obviously such a clear goal for them of like, this is the guiding philosophy behind our lenses, and that they're all 1.8. It's not, some aren't 1.2 and some are 2.0. They're all 1.8. And I just think everything about that is brilliant. And it's a differentiating factor that is really interesting to me because nobody else has done that yet. So
totally. Yeah, no, they're honestly wonderful lenses. It's funny, in Japan, there was a lot of us that were, and I'm not sure if I was entirely part of this camp, but there was folks that were like, I would have probably preferred just a nice 24-70 2.8. I think a lot of that had to do with that we had to fly back with all these lenses. Right. That wasn't the funnest experience, but I feel like there was a few of us that were like, there's nothing entirely wrong with just having a nice 24-70 sometimes, right? But having had these primes now, like, to be honest, what I've really loved is the 18 mil. The 18 mil 1.8 on a full frame, it gives you that sort of like Chivo Revenant look, right? I've really, really been enjoying that. And the fact that it's at 1.8, and again, it's one of the pros of shooting full frame, is like getting that nice, big, almost like large format look. It's giving me almost like an IMAX vibe, especially if you shoot the 6K open gate. I love the wide angle. I love that it's at 1.8. You get like all my A-roll on my main channel has been the 18 mil for the last couple videos. And so I've loved the look of it. I think all the primes, like you said, are amazing because they're all the exact same size. I love that they're all the same filter thread, all the same weight. It's really easy to compact and put it into your kit. They're great lenses. I literally have like zero complaints about the lenses.
Well, another detail that like I feel like nobody was really telling me enough. Obviously, you were on the Panasonic side, maybe knowing this, but that they don't breathe. This killed me in my R5 Thailand video. So I recorded two videos with there. One was like a talking head, and the talking head, the autofocus, first of all, on the R5 was like going crazy. I know we're talking like, oh, Panasonic's not as good as his Canon or Sony. They're far from perfect. I mean, it was freaking out. Like, it almost ruined my video how much the autofocus was. I think partly I was wearing a hat, and the brim of the cap might have been, I don't even know. I don't want to apologize for it. It was doing a terrible job. Yeah. But the breathing, as it would focus in and out of the 15 to 35 2.8, which is an extremely expensive lens. This is like a $3,000 lens. Was like the breathing. It's like it was zooming in and out as it autofocused. It was like painful. It was brutal. The sides of the frame are shifting. Like it looks like a 2 millimeter focal length as it refocuses, and these don't breathe perceptibly. Like I don't see any change.
Sure. There is a little bit, but yeah, you're not going to notice. And it's funny. Like I was talking to I was talking to Jordan Drake about that when we were in Japan, where it's like, instead of making better lenses, Sony said, let's just compensate for it in camera, right? So they brought breathing compensation to a lot of the newer cameras, right? Whereas I think Lumix was in a good position with their partnership with Leica and the lenses and stuff, where they could say, we're doing it from scratch anyways. Let's just build them properly, right? Yeah. So instead of like trying to fix this in post because we don't want to redo our optics, let's actually make nice lenses that don't have horrible breathing in them. And on top of that, they know breathing over exemplifies bad autofocus too, right? Because you really see that shift happening, right? And so it's nice that these are so well controlled. They feel a lot like, not that I still consider them very photo. They're like sharp fall off, but they do behave from a breathing standpoint much like a cinema lens would, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, there's one other detail I appreciated looking. This was more from other people's reviews because I didn't A/B test them compared to other lens manufacturers. But the bokeh is also better than some of the like more heavily praised Sigmas in terms of so often people will like show a reference photo of bokeh and they'll be like, look, the bokeh's creamy. And it's like, well, it's blurry. I mean, there's only a few attributes to look at in bokeh that really are significant. And it's like the shape of it, like how much is it round versus having some like other kind of structure to it. And then there's also if you just like have a perfect circle of light, is it evenly distributed where it falls off in a smooth gradient? Or what can happen on especially some nice Sigmas is you'll have like a flare around the outside. Like it'll look like somebody's drawn a circle around the outside of the blur hole and there's like definition to it. It's not smooth as it falls away. And a bunch of those details, just as you look at the image quality, like that's kind of what they selected for, as opposed to absolute sharpness, which these don't excel the most at. Like they're it seems like the camera is doing some quite a bit of correction, like, you know, barrel distortion is being removed in the camera or in Lightroom if you're shooting raw photos. They're not crazy sharp. They're just sharp enough. But instead, it was optimizing for these other things that like kind of are really like practical when it comes to shooting video. May not be the most, if this was going to be mostly a photo camera for you, I'd set a different set of priorities possibly. But for video, I just like that they chose this set of priorities. I mean, I just think it was really well thought out.
I don't know if you've played with it much because the camera has autofocus now, but the throw on them is also really nice. So the way the feel of the lens is, like I had Lee Zavitz playing with it recently, and his first comment when he picked it up, he's like, "Oh my God, I love the feedback on the focus, right? It's got like a nice pushback on it, right? And on top of that, you get all the options in settings. Like, do you want it linear, non-linear, all that kind of stuff. You can sort of set and customize it as much as you want, right? I just think they're really nice feeling lenses. They don't feel cheap at all.
I also think, you know, in the RF generation, I famously have not been using RF lenses till recently. This 1535 is my first. Their choice to put that control ring on the front, I think, was the wrong choice. I don't use it. I don't like it.
It's a gimmick.
And it just it complicates the lens. And it means that you have a smaller area to grab when you're going to be focusing. And on these Panasonics, they made the opposite choice. There was only one ring, and it is large and confident, and like you know to grab it. So anyway, I just like I love what they decided to do with the set of lenses, and you know, I don't know. I hope I get to use them for a little while. But back to what you're saying about wishing we had the 24-70. I agree that like that's actually what I would use most of the time. Is like there's a 16-35 and a 24-70. If I had those, I'd probably end up using them more often than the primes. Prime shooting is slower in a way that I have a hard time making time for that style of shooting these days. I just need to move more quickly than they really allow. So I love when I can kind of play with them, which I've been doing in the studio, but in reality, I'll see how much I can practically put them to use in my everyday shooting.
It's a funny thing that it kind of loops back. Like it's the sort of give and take that I have with cameras that can do a crop mode, like have an APS-C, is that you sort of get two lenses out of everything, right? Because if you're shooting on a 24, you can punch that 1.5 and you're kind of pushing almost like a 40, 35-ish, right? And so it's nice that this camera, unlike an A7S III, because it's only 12 megapixels, you don't have that APS-C crop on that camera. You don't have it with an FX3 either, right? Because we're using oversampled, like with an A7 IV and the S5 Mark II, we have that crop mode, which just extends. So if you add 24-70, you're going to get another 1.5 out of it if you need to. A lot of people that shoot weddings love that extra little punch that you can get out of it, right? And so it's nice, even with the primes, if you're stuck with one, you're kind of getting two lenses out of it because you do have that APS-C crop mode, right?
That's true. Let's also just touch on image quality for a second, which, again, if anybody's tried an S5, it's kind of the same thing, but a lot of people haven't. So my reaction to it, like my feeling with it is like, it's much sharper than my C70. So because C70 is like kind of at the end of, I don't think there'll be many more cameras that aren't oversampling 4K, right? C70 is a 4K sensor, so C300, Sony's not really doing that as much anymore. But you can see the difference. Like it is just visibly sharper. Anything coming out of the R5 or the S5II or the FX3 or anything like that are all like it just has this precision to it that you would need to add sharpening to have that same feeling from a 4K sensor. And then in terms of dynamic range, it's got enough. I'm going to wait to see people that have actually measured it properly, because it's actually very hard to test in a useful way. But because it's using like a proper V-log, the gamut curve and the gamma curve and the color gamut are as wide as a professional needs to use. That's what I'm asking for. I'm not asking for every camera to look like a Retina or Alexa, but what kills me on the R5 is like C-Log 3 is not flat enough. There's not enough dynamic range there to really get what you want out of the image. You're just kind of throwing away data that the sensor should be able to record and doesn't seem to. So they've kind of given you all the image quality that the sensor can offer, and it's plenty. It's what everything, it's matches any other camera in that body size can do. And some people might talk about like, well, Sony still has that like insane low light stuff, which I think is massively overrated and should not be the priority for anybody.
No, that's your National Geographic. I've never really understood like, oh, I can shoot in moonlight. Like, why are you shooting in moonlight?
Yeah,
like,
how often?
How often is that something that
you've made
need,
some
right?
wrong decisions in life if you're shooting in
Totally.
moonlight.
Speaking of like just the image quality, like I've said this in videos before, and one of my last camera videos that I did was an A7IV versus S5 video, because I thought the conversation even at the time was bigger than just autofocus, and it always was to me, because there's just tools like we talked about that make this a better filmmaking camera. But I also just like subjectively, and I don't love doing comparisons anymore, because I don't think anybody's going to consume your work that way. They're not watching. No one's watching your videos and putting up Red Komodo footage being like, I wish it was as nice as this Red Komodo. We're doing that. You're probably doing that, but no one else is doing that, right? And so I always found that when I did A7IV versus S5, there was a subjective quality to what I found with Lumix and Vlog, that it just had that, I don't want to call it the cinema look because it's such a broad statement, but I do feel like the roll-off and the highlights and the way the tone of the image felt closer to what we expect from what a cinema camera looks like compared to A7IV, FX3, FX30, the cameras I've been shooting a lot for the last year, have a little bit more of a mirrorless digital look to them that you have to sort of compensate with in post. So it's your workflow after can bring it to the same level as an S5. But out of camera, I've always found the Lumix Vlog, all of that has just had a tone and a highlight roll-off for me that is easier to trick people into thinking you're using a Red or an RE and with your transforms and stuff. It's a little bit easier to get that look that I think a lot of us strive for with Vlog. Again, totally subjective. Anybody watching this might see it and say, I hate the way the Lumix works. I totally understand that, because I think there's so much psychology around what we think of image quality. But I would just say subjectively, when I put them side by side, I'm always leaning more towards the Lumix.
Yeah, no, right now, the only brand not doing it well is the Canon. So like the R5C is the best example of it, because that's meant to be a cinema first camera, and the fact that it's only got C-Log 3 doesn't give you much room. But Vlog, it's got it all. Like you're saying, it's just like it's super flexible, however you want to transform it. And I've got to do those comparisons to where Sony is at right now, because obviously they're working really hard on it. And it's always interesting to see as well. They're basically using, I think, the same sensors more or less, and it's that like how they choose to guide that pipeline has made the Panasonic image just really, I don't know, just like it feels clean as soon as you throw your LUT on it. Whereas the issue with Sony has always been that like that default look is like, this looks kind of weird. It's like, why doesn't this feel like natural? And if you don't have time to really go in depth with the color grading, if you only have time to throw a LUT on it, your Sony footage may come out looking not beautiful. Whereas I think it's easier to get to that point. Yeah, like you're saying with.
Yeah, I can't guarantee it. There was a lot of us talking about it when we were in Japan, but like theoretically, the camera should be using the A7 III sensor.
Yeah. That's my
Same
assumption.
megapixels. Yeah. That's my assumption is too. So again, anybody listening, we don't have this. We don't know for sure. It's a theoretical thing because a lot of these cameras are using Sony sensors, and that's a broader conversation in general. Where I would love to see Lumix, Nikon, all these companies move to a different sensor company, so we're not at the mercy of the sort of like slim pickings hand-me-downs of older cameras, right? But whatever that Lumix is doing in the CPU processing pipeline, do not compare this to what an A7 III looks like. So you'll see people saying, oh, it's the A7 III sensor. I'm sure people will say it even in reviews.
Yeah.
It's not the same. I never would have bought an A7 III. I never thought that camera looked great or good.
Yeah.
It was not until the A7S III, A7 IV that I thought Sony was starting to look half decent.
Totally.
And I will just say that the S5 doesn't look anything like the color that was coming out of an A7 III. It's night and day.
I want to clarify that so much because there's a bit of a useful shortcut to mention the A7 III sensor because basically it's the same. But that was the last Sony that I used a lot. I shot a lot on the A7 III, and the colors were so painful. It was really hard to work with. Like, it was frustrating and awful in many ways, color-wise. But that was generations behind in terms of processing, and everything they've done, like this, like you're saying, completely different image. It would be hard to tell that it was the same sensor.
So I have a question for you. Have you done much rolling shutter? Because I feel like there's no way it's as bad as what the A7 III used to be.
I've never cared about rolling shutter. Like, it just doesn't come up in my life very much. Like, you really got to be doing kind of the sloppy handheld thing that just is not happening in many of my videos anymore. I used to have a few more like vloggy shots, but even then it's not the thing that I would notice in the frame.
Totally.
So I kind of did the whip pan tests with this camera. It's like, it rolls. It
rolls. Yeah.
It's not clean, but so is an Alexa. Like, this is visible in most cameras. And so maybe I'm just the wrong person because I'm not super sensitive to it. So
I will say that there's something interesting that happens with the IBIS, sort of compensates a little bit for that too, because you're not getting jerky movements that would sort of add to the effect of the jello because you're moving so quickly, right? So when that IBIS sensor would shift, you would get like a really bad, like that happens a lot with the A7 IV. I really noticed the rolling shutter on the A7 IV. Whereas I found, even though the S5 Mark II does have rolling shutter, you can definitely see it when you go crazy with it, the IBIS sort of compensates for it because it's so swaying and smooth. You don't notice it nearly as much as you probably would have on an A7 III or A7 IV or any Sony camera. Like, it's even felt better than my FX30, which has a fairly quick readout speed for what it is.
Right, because I think the sensor actually has more room to move. It has more room physically. To compensate with the IBIS. So it is actually swinging less. It is physically moving a bit less.
Totally.
So that makes sense. So,
and that's Sony's biggest problem, right? That's Sony's big problem with IBIS is they're latching onto that E-mount, which is too close to the flange distance, right? So they don't really have the room that Lumix does because they got to build a full frame camera from the ground up. So if you look inside an S5, there's a massive gap in there between the lens and the sensor. They've got all the room in the world to play with it. You open up an A7 IV or an FX3, that sensor's nearly right at the flange distance, right? And so that also helps with like adapting lenses and stuff too. There's like harder to do speed boosting and whatnot on a lot of the Sony cameras because of that E-mount, whereas L-mount's in a much better position to take PL and everything that you need to sort of modify and adapt to. It's just, again, you got to look at, they came at it a little bit late, right? So they're almost like they kind of took the Apple approach in a little bit way where like Android did a whole bunch of stuff. Let's do it a little bit better, right? Let's take what they did and we'll make it a little bit better. And so it's nice that the S system and the full frame system from Lumix is so new. We're only talking 3 years, right? And so we're in that, like I said, that startup phase where things get really interesting with this camera. I feel like this camera has the ability to change the industry a little bit if it's successful because cameras will have to catch up to Lumix. It's sort of the opposite at this point. If they keep going, right, that's an interesting perspective, right? That's an interesting perspective that they're at right now.
When you're talking about the flange distance, it reminds me of one detail that drives me crazy. Some Sonys do this too, is that the default of the shutter is to stay open when you change lenses, when you turn off the camera.
Yeah.
I don't understand this. Like, it's so friggin' frustrating because like my lens just is dirty so often. I need to blow it out between almost every lens change. And you know what, on the R5, it's not an issue. It is just not an issue. I don't get sensor dust like almost ever. And all it is that the shutter closes in between. And I like looked at some people talking about this in forums and they're like, oh, it's because your shutter is so sensitive. I'm like, you know what's sensitive is my sensor.
Dust.
Like, it's way more sensitive than the shutter. And I'd much rather replace the shutter than the sensor. It's cheaper to fix too.
Absolutely.
Like, everything about that thinking is insane to me. And I know some of the newer Sonys let you choose it in the menu. I don't know which ones, but you can force it to close. Please let me do this, Lumix. Like, I'm very stressed out looking at my sensor all the time, and it is filthy all the time. Like, I really noticed this. I was watching A Long Way Up, the Ewan McGregor documentary. It's pretty clearly shot on Sony's. I think, I checked afterwards. It's shot on Sony, and there's sensor dust pretty often. And like, Of course there is. They're like on the road in dusty environments. He's got to change lenses sometimes, and you can't always keep it clean. Like, just acknowledge this and let me make some choices to prevent it, please.
Totally. Absolutely.
But yeah, things to come. You know what? If the S2H can get a really new sensor on there, I don't know what's next in the pipeline that Lumix might have access to, but if they're like, if this could be like a stacked sensor or something fancier than what is, obviously we're working with something a little bit older here, but even it just being a more expensive camera because the S5II is their affordable full frame option, right? Oh, and we missed saying that the S5II was also announced, which I'm less excited about, to be honest. It's like the more professional version. But I don't need any of its features.
In a way, but it's the thing. It's like I talked about this even with Lee and the XH2S. Like even the GH6, I talked about it, right? Like ProRes is cool, but we're at a point now where it's not integral to my workflow by any means. And I'm much more into shooting, H.265 and saving on the file sizes because the quality is so damn good that, I don't need ProRes. Like I shot a show for Bell, which is a network here in Canada, like 3 months ago, and we shot on the FX3 and the A7IV, and they needed a whole DNX HR transfer. We still shot H.265. We just transcoded after, right? The bit rate was still high enough, right? And so it was easier for us to save our media throughout shooting, because if we were shooting ProRes, we would have been blowing terabytes a day, right? As opposed to like half a gig sometimes of a day of shooting, right? In H.265. So I will say that X is cool from a visual standpoint. So if anybody's not familiar, it's like all blacked out. It's cool. It looks sweet. I think all cameras should probably have less branding. That's just a nicer, in general, that should be the way it goes. But the fact that you can also record to SSD is probably the more interesting thing with that camera, as opposed to the fact that it does ProRes. I think every camera should have the option to shoot to an SSD. But for the couple $100 more, I would actually probably maybe be inclined to go with the X, just because visually I think it's cool and it's nice to have that feature. But like you said, it's not something that was like a make or break between both of them. It's if you have the couple extra $100 to go for it. But it's not a deal breaker feature by any means.
No, I think most of the pro features that a lot of us will be looking for will come in future generations. Like I say, like the S2H or whatever happens after that. But the X is almost like ProRes has become more of a narrowly pro feature lately, where in professional studios, the editing pipeline will be constrained to they require certain codecs because I actually don't even know why they get so, why they can't be more flexible.
Legacy thoughts. Yeah,
totally,
it's legacy, whatever. Yeah.
But on anybody that's editing on a laptop or just a home computer or home PC of some kind, it used to be more significant when the compressed H.264, H.265 footage was too heavy for our computers to handle. But the weird thing is, as the M1 generation of Apple computers came out, it suddenly stopped mattering. All of a sudden we can edit all this footage. And at the same time, all the cameras were like, hey, finally we have ProRes. And it's like, well, I don't need it anymore because my computer's fast enough. So it was a really weird timing thing. But that's totally what ProRes is good for, is your computer. It doesn't generally look any better. It's super rare. There are the amount of scenes where ProRes looks better is extremely uncommon.
Minimal.
So
absolutely.
Anyway, I think Panasonic's in a good place. I'm suddenly going to be paying a lot more attention to them.
Like for me, it's like I've been waiting for just someone to take a bit out of the lunch of Sony, right? It's because there's been an opportunity because they're doing so many. I think Sony's doing nearly more things wrong than right, but the things they're doing right are just so good that they've caught a lot of us. They've caught a lot of us because we were putting up with a lot of crap to get something that I know at the base is still inferior to what could be possible, right? And so I've been thinking about this in my own review of the S5 Mark II. It's like, I still see myself gravitating still towards the FX30 and my A7 IV, particularly for photos. But with the FX30, what's interesting about that camera is I think we've even talked about this on Twitter before, but I'm a little bit tired of these really great video cameras being wrapped in these photo bodies, right? It's probably why the C70 is one of the cameras that you like too. It's I love that FX30, not because of the image quality or anything like that. I just love the body. I love that it's not trying to be a photo camera. Right. And I found with the S5 Mark II, as much as I love all the video features, I still feel like I'm holding on to a hybrid. And it's why? I'm sure there's a lot of hybrid shooters and they want that. But give me that option to have that camera in a little bit more of a cinema-focused workhorse video camera, right?
Yeah.
And the crazy thing about Lumix is they're in a really good position for that because they have their box cameras already, right? So BGH1 and BS1H I'm telling everybody watching this, I am in their ear constantly. Put a little screen on that camera, put the phase detect. That's the camera I want, right? Give me a hybrid red Komodo looking little thing with everything that an S5 does or an S1 does with autofocus. And I'm like, there it is. That's the camera I've been waiting. Internal ND, and we're set, right? Like that's butter.
There's got to be a way to get like, I know the issue is some interaction between IBIS and internal ND is really hard, but like somebody solve this problem. Find a way, because I hate.
Or let me choose between the two. If I got to turn one off to get the other one, sure. But let me decide, right?
Because I'm never going to go back to a situation where I only have mirrorless bodies. Having the C70 is like, okay, no, this is necessary in my life. I need a cinema body that is focused on this. And yeah, it is kind of weird actually, because I feel like Panasonic isn't that concerned about photographers. This does work well as a photo camera, actually. I mean, we didn't talk about it much, but it's going to be totally fine. Like there aren't any major red flags. No. But we were talking about all the lens choices they made. Like all those primes are meant for filmmakers.
For video.
They still feel like they are really putting photographers first in a sort of strange way, but I don't know. I'm sure they have their reasons.
No, you know what happened? This is actually funny that this stays in here. The A7IV overheated.
Oh, hey, there we go.
There we
A7IV
go.
Overheated.
A7IV overheated.
That's why I like my C70. It's never going to happen. Let's move on from Panasonic, but good to know. Obviously, there'll be follow-up as we continue to test it. But while we're talking about video stuff, the two more things that we want to hit, I'll talk about Resolve a little bit, and again, we'll end with Twitter. Hopefully we don't go too deep on it. Okay, so the Thailand video, I did all of my finishing in Resolve, which is the first time I've done a YouTube video where like I really went hard, just like pulling out all the stops, and like, I did some sky replacements. I really like color graded every shot pretty in depth, and put a lot more effort than I usually would on YouTube in the finishing process, because typically it's just so much faster to keep it all in Final Cut. And I guess I'll start with saying that's how I ended up maxing out my M1 Max laptop. Any noise reduction at all, the smallest amount, will make it crawl. And I did end up needing to do that a bunch, because the R5 it needs to be exposed in like a pretty narrow window of like what looks nice from C-Log 3. If it's underexposed at all, the noise gets horrible in the shadows. But if you overexpose, if you expose to the right, the highlights start to thin out a lot. It's not really that they clip, but the color depth drops quickly. Like you don't have a lot, you can't bring them down very far and keep the saturation in the highlights. So you kind of just need to expose it correctly all the time, and it suffers if you don't. So I did run a bunch of noise removal on it. And then also I ended up not adding any grain to the YouTube video, but I really wanted to. I did a bunch of tests trying to find something that would hold on nicely in YouTube, and none of them looked good enough. But if I just turn on any of the grain emulations, it would not play back in real time. But I know you use Resolve. What's your kind of workflow with it right now?
The only thing I use it for, and I saw in your node tree that you've been starting playing with Filmbox. It's the only reason I stick with Resolve for some projects. I don't use it for everything. I've gotten fairly close to what I like from an emulation standpoint that I can pull off in Final Cut now. But when I want halation and I want it to go real filmy, I throw it through Filmbox. But I'll bounce a ProRes into. It's funny we're talking about pros again, but I'll bounce a 422 ProRes over to Resolve and just do my halation and stuff like that, and then I'll bounce it back over to Final Cut and finish up whatever I got to finish up. But through using Filmbox, and I have a video on Filmbox on my channel because I actually use it a lot for photography too, which I know it's not designed for, but I use it to.
No, I didn't know you had a video about it. I got to watch.
Yeah,
that
I do.
after.
Yeah.
This answers all my questions.
I think the title is like how to emulate film without LUTs, because it's basically a turnkey plugin system. Totally. A DIT friend of mine, so a digital imaging technician that I know, actually got me onto all of the Video Village products. Like their stuff is amazing. Scatter is also really good by them, which is like a diffusion.
And to warn everybody before you go to the link, it's crazy expensive. Like,
it's very expensive, and that's every comment on that video is just like, "Why you could have told me how much it costs?" And I was like, "If I told you, you wouldn't have watched the video." So. But for me, it's like, because I don't consider myself a professional colorist. I do things by eye. I don't know the ins and outs of why it looks good. I just do whatever I got to do to get it to look the way I want it to look. And so instead of paying or with time to learn it or paying someone to do it for me, my colorist is just buying Filmbox. So I do the yearly license on it, and it's paid for itself easily on most projects that I've used it for, right? And on top of that, I just think it looks the best. I've tried, Dehancer. I've tried every emulation you can probably get under the sun. And Film Convert, like they've tried to work with me, and it's like it's one of those things where it's like I like the product, but it's just not quite good enough that I would use it or recommend it. So Filmbox has been the one for me.
In terms of color, like the transform and then the final like film color, Filmbox is way ahead of both Dehancer and Film Convert, which same thing. Like I've got them all installed, but it's like visibly different. I'd say the downside of Filmbox to me is that it really only has one look. Even though there are a few different ones to select,
it's subtle. It's very subtle. Yeah, it's subtle.
They're basically identical, and I really could use some more flexibility, especially like a good example is like the greens go very cool, like extremely cool, like, Fuji cool. And I'm like, sometimes I don't want that. Like it's a very bold choice for the green colors. I'm like, but that's not what all film, like that's not the only choice to make. So it's weird to me that they don't have like 2 or 3 different big shifts in terms of some of the way that the transform looks, but it's excellent. Yeah. So same thing. Yeah. I used it for all of the transforms in that video. Yeah. And I do also slightly prefer it to any of the LUTs I've been able to generate on my own. Same, so, I'm often creating stuff that I think works pretty well. That's usually what my videos are like, but that's also usually a cleaner look. Film Convert is like it's a powerful, like, you are aiming for film and less clean. It tints your highlights unless you really kind of rein it in. So but super fun. The things I wanted to talk about Resolve for, though, is like, I'm just blown away how far ahead it is from Final Cut in terms of, stabilization. It's just like devastating. Final Cut is almost, it is unusable. I do not use stabilization.
It's terrible.
And
it's so bad.
It like fixed a lot of those wobble shots that I was saying a minute ago. The R5, like it looked so bad. I was like, oh, the shot's dead. I can't use it. Yeah. I turn on stabilization just with the default settings in Resolve, and it just fixes it. It's just usable, and it barely cropped in. Like I was expecting, like, oh, it's going to have to punch in like 10% to get rid of those corners. I don't really know what it's doing. It does like a tiny little crop, and all that wobble is gone and isn't adding it. Because with Final Cut, even though I know it's not good, I'll still test it when a shot's really bad. I'm like, can I save it?
Can I save it?
Always. For sure. The artifacts are so bad. Like it adds so much jello and wobble that I'm like, nope, never. Like it's never usable. It always makes the shot worse. I didn't run into a single version of that in Resolve. It always was usable. And that's just so huge that it just like, it is actually super functional.
Yeah.
I don't know.
My only thing was, no, absolutely. The Resolve save. I've talked to Leah about this too, because it's like I've had an issue because I keep complaining to other Sony users about the IBIS because I feel like I'm taking crazy pills. It's so bad, but everyone's like, oh, but I guess it's what you get used to, right? But it's funny because I keep telling them like if I throw Final Cut stabilization on A7 IV footage, it's just. It doesn't even know what to do with it. It goes all over the place. It's wobbling in the corners. It's going crazy. It's cropping in these weird. It's monumentally worse than just leaving it a bit shaky. Then I throw it in Resolve and I press a little button, and not only is it like nearly instantaneous too, it's very minimal crop and it just works. It just does it. Like there's no croppy, warpy things. It's not punching too much. It just works. If there's one thing that I wish Final Cut would just figure out is the stabilization. Like they're very, very. I mean, there's monumental things in color and stuff I would wish they would figure out too. But like a simple one for most users is stabilization. Like give me something that's decent that just works as a turnkey, right? The only solution in Final Cut that I found is if you get into third-party plugins. But like even the third-party plugins barely are as good as the Resolve one. So it's like Resolve, the free one, you still get stabilization. It's worth just having Resolve to stabilize clips, which is a ridiculous notion, but it is.
There are all these little finishing details that as I'm using them, I'm like, how can I ever go back to finishing in Final Cut unless it's just a talking head? So also, okay, well, this is a bit of a specific one, but I was doing sky replacements on a few shots because like just times that like, oh, there's no sky. It's like super cloudy or my sky's clipped a bit. And in Final Cut, I'd just be like, okay, I'm only going to balance the overall exposure. I'll try to like lower the exposure a bit to try to bring back the skies. That's it. And then I like stop touching it. But, you can do things like Magic Mask that you just say like, okay, this is basically the sky. And you run tracking back and forth, which is pretty quick. And all of a sudden, the whole sky has a perfect animated mask with whatever is happening. a little note, you do have to select better quality. If you do faster, the artifacts are bad in the sky. So select better quality. And then now Resolve has a new sky generation thing, which I don't know why nobody else does this, like Final Cut or Luminar, all these other places that do sky replacement. You still need a sky library. You need a whole bunch of photos you've saved over time that match the general environment. In DaVinci, you can just say like, no, okay, give me a blue. Okay, now put some clouds on it, and turn it down a little bit so it's not too fake. I don't think people are going to notice which shots I added the sky back into because it's super subtle. It's creating its own clouds. I'm just like, this is the way it should be. Absolutely. Super smart.
I didn't even know there was a sky replacement thing in Resolve.
Yeah, it's new.
That's cool.
It's crazy cool. What am I forgetting about? What is the other finishing stuff? I mean, there's more audio flexibility, obviously.
Yeah,
just way more depth. Period.
Better. Yeah, totally. And just the node system is just a better way. Like the fact that Final Cut doesn't even have like adjustment layers built into it. Like you got to do that on your own is so ridiculous. And I still don't think anybody really understands like the layer system and the inspector of like what goes where in your sort of your progress, your tree of what happens. Like, do you do your LUT first, your transform? Do you do your little color grading? Who knows, right? And so like a lot of it's just a mess when it comes to just finishing and color grading. But it's kind of like my Sony versus Lumix thing where it's like there's so many things that are wrong. But man, if I am not like lightning faster with magnetic timeline cutting than I am any other program, right?
Totally. No, I didn't want to leave without saying that. Like I still had to. I did all the editing was still in Final Cut, and I did. This was the first time I didn't have an issue passing the XML file back and forth, and it's because intentionally I didn't do any speed adjustments because that is like a big play. They just treat speed totally differently. So if you do slow motion or speed ramping, Resolve doesn't understand the way that Final Cut does it, so it just gets it wrong. So do that later. And then also I didn't do any titles or like extremely basic titles, but assume that you're going to fix them later, either fix them in Resolve or Final Cut, whatever you do. But because I didn't do that, it all worked. And Final Cut, because I had to do some of the editing in Resolve just to like finish it up. And the main way of describing, because people were asking me on Twitter, like, why do you keep using Final Cut? Because obviously you're making Resolve sound pretty good. Final Cut doesn't want you to break the edit. So at the beginning, they're similar. Like, you're just dropping stuff in a timeline. That isn't very different. You can do that almost the same way. But as the edit gets a little bit more complex, Resolve is happy to let you drag a clip over top of everything else that you've done and just delete it, like overwrite everything. If you start moving things around, you don't realize what you broke later on in the timeline. Resolve will let you break everything and not warn you about it. And Final Cut's like, no, like we know you probably made all these choices intentionally. So if you're going to add something earlier in the timeline, you probably don't want to break everything else you did. So magnetic timeline is so much more intuitive, more smart. It's smart. Better. Yeah. So I can't switch.
I'm sure it's how we started. You just sort of learn the language, right? But for me, like I can't grasp my head around like I can edit in Premiere and Resolve if I have to, and I've definitely done edits in it. But I'm just so much slower because I'm consciously trying to figure out like, well, if I do this, that screws that up, and if I do this, it might screw this up, and I got to move all of that over there. And like now, I understand more why people that use Avid and Resolve and Premiere, they sort of edit in chunks. Right? They have like long timelines that are chunk based, right? And it's like scene by scene by scene, and then you sort of put everything back together. Whereas with Final Cut, I just find that it does that for you. It's keeping chunks together for you automatically, right? So it's just a bit of a brain switch on it, but I just find it so much more intuitive with Final Cut, and I'm just way, way faster at it.
Yeah. So I don't know. I've been trying to like figure out how do I balance these two for a while. I'm still working on it, but this was the first video I successfully used both, and it was fantastic. So I don't know. Yeah. More on that to come. Totally. Let's make sure we hit Twitter for a second.
Yeah. What a mess of a site that is now.
Yeah. So I mean, it's the whole time it's been pointless to talk about it in the current moment because it's always been shifting too quickly to
way too quick. Yeah.
Have whatever you say be relevant for very long. I don't know. We're both still there. So maybe absolutely. That's the place to start is like, why are we both still using it? And did you sign up for Mastodon? I didn't notice.
I didn't even bother. I don't know. Cause I thought the sign up process was so asinine and terrible that I was like, I was just like, there's no chance. And I had a tweet where I was just like, I'm not going to care about an app until like social media people and tech people are talking about it. I'm just not like, so you can squat handles all you want. You want to go on what's that other one called? Hive. Like people are going on Hive. Vero, whatever.
Yeah.
Right. And it's like, sure, we can all talk about it, that we have our account there and we do whatever, but it's like, I'm not going to do it until like my brother who doesn't do anything on the internet is going to tell me, have you been on this site? Have you been on this app? When it hits critical mass, I'll care. I'm not worried about having to build a following somewhere else. We can figure that out. Right. And so that's why it's like totally on the back burner for me. I could honestly care less about those apps until this either dies in a terrible fire and we have no choice. But right now, I feel like Twitter is still able to be the site that you want it to be to an extent. I still have my core and our people that are sort of always there and they're engaging with, and they're generally pleasant people. And so I haven't had like a terrible experience yet. And it's fairly easy to avoid the bad parts of Twitter if you're smart about it. And here's the thing, like I don't necessarily agree with most of the decisions Elon has made so far, or anything to do with him as a person, to be honest. But
yeah,
it
he's been a douchebag, like just
absolutely. And so but it hasn't affected my actual day to day just yet, right? So when I'm on that site and I'm sharing the things I want to share, it's still been mostly a pleasant experience, right? There's a few blips here and there where something blows up and it sucks, and everybody's talking about this stupid thing for a little bit, and that sucks. But generally speaking, just like in life, there's mostly good things happening and sometimes some bad things go around. And it sort of reflects that, generally speaking. And so I'm still on it. And the people that I know and I'm friends with all seem to still be on it too. And the people that I have left, like, I don't know if they'll ever come back or if it's a permanent thing, but I don't know. I feel like it's a little too early I think it's too early to make that call that I'm going to ditch it entirely.
I've been confused by what is driving people to ditch it entirely. I mean, I get that people will make protest decisions like that because they want to make a point about that, Elon's being a bad person, because like I think he generally has been in a variety of ways. But first of all, I think most people running companies, you don't just hide their dirt, and he does it. He just hangs his dirt out to dry. Like you see what a douchebag he is, but like, I don't, it's not like I think Mark Zuckerberg's like a way better person behind closed doors, or even Steve Jobs, like even people at Apple, which, like they know how to compose themselves publicly. But I'm sure if you saw them in every boardroom meeting, sometimes you'd be like, wow, that's not cool. I just don't feel like I'm going to make my product decisions based on that primarily. So it felt like a lot of people were leaving because they're like, this place fell apart. I'm out of here. And I'm just a little bit confused about what they were experiencing or seeing, because the only real way that Twitter has gotten worse for me that I've seen is how much everybody was talking about, how much everybody's retweeting what Elon says and like arguing with him and just like getting in fights about Twitter. That's what felt like it was dragging it down more than anything else. But the things I post, I'm still like getting useful feedback as a response, interesting arguments that are totally civil. Like it is just not falling apart the way that I use it. And people are generally still like kind and also are there. Like it's not a ghost town. So I don't know. I don't want to be an apologist for it. Like I don't own Twitter shares. Like it's I feel like the reporting on it has been weird and not in line with my experience.
There's something that happens in a lot of situations in life where there's always going to be a group that kind of want to see the forest burn in a weird way, right? They kind of want things to go south because it's interesting. And there's a lot of like drama hungry people on these apps that just sort of want everything to go south. And so you kind of got to like just wade through that water of BS and realize that like, even if there's a very large group of people saying this is terrible and it's awful and we're all leaving, you don't need to follow suit. You can sort of still make your own experience, and that experience can still be positive. And like you said, like I can still post a picture of my breakfast and everyone loves it and they all talk about it and we're just having a nice time. It's completely irrelevant. It's like a meaningless moment, but we all shared it. And I think that's nice to have apps like that you can still do that. Not everything has to be the most poignant, crazy, thought-provoking element of your day. And so for me, Twitter's always been a place for me to experiment and, for lack of a better word, shitpost and have fun and be a goof and joke around and whatever. Like, I don't take it seriously and I have no intention to take it seriously. And so maybe that's it. I don't know. Maybe because I don't take it seriously, I haven't been that precious about it. But I think that attitude has helped me sort of foster a community that is on the same page, right? And so we're all kind of thinking the same way. And that's why I feel like it's still an app that you make yourself. It's still the way you want to experience it. It sort of gives back.
Yeah, I totally agree. I also do think that like when you don't like the direction that an app's going, it's okay to bitch about it, which, I did when they mentioned their whole thing of like, oh, you can't post links to external
that's the whole
social
point
media.
of
I was just like,
the site. Yeah, you have to be able to do that. Absolutely.
So it's fine to just complain. But like,
Totally.
I didn't get banned for complaining and saying that Elon's making terrible choices. I didn't take down my YouTube links. I didn't take down my link tree. Like, I was still just like, the protest to me is like, just pretend that this stupid decision wasn't made. And if it ruins my experience, that's when I leave. But I don't know. It's just, it's an odd choice to me for people that like deleted their whole account because they don't like Elon might be gone in 3 months. Like, you never know. So I don't know, if people like really are fed up, maybe you just stop using it. You don't need to delete your account.
No, it's like that's how I treated Facebook. Yeah, and LinkedIn. Yeah. Like I stopped using LinkedIn. I stopped using Facebook years ago, but I didn't delete the accounts. They still exist. They're still there, right? And it's like
I didn't even delete my MySpace.
Yeah, exactly. I'm sure all that stuff still exists, right? Yeah. And so I don't understand the complete absent. I'm going to delete everything. This is the worst thing that's ever happened. I got to get out of here while I still can. Like just rushing for the border of it made no sense to me. But I hope that they can find audiences on those other apps because like for me, Twitter is just a great like lead generator for all the content that I do. It's like a great way for me to have a community that I don't really have on YouTube where I don't have that like sort of direct, you've probably noticed this too. Like you don't really get that same sort of direct conversation with a lot of people in the other apps, right? And so I have my like loyal fans and dedicated people, and I'm fans of other people that I can have these conversations with. Like we wouldn't have this podcast if it wasn't together right now, if it wasn't for Twitter. We wouldn't know each other pretty much, right? And so it's like that to me is so invaluable. So I'm worried I won't be able to find that somewhere else if it does go away, but I'm not going to worry about that when I have to.
If I sound frustrated about other people leaving, it's because like the value of Twitter isn't the brand. It's not anything to do with the company. It's that we were all there. It's that it's a common space where it's like, I know I can find other YouTubers. I know that if I see somebody's channel, I'm like, wow, I love their work. I can just go follow them because they're probably on Twitter. Now, if half of them are on Mastodon and half are on Five and whatever, I mean, I'm just not, it means there's like less people in that community that I'm able to discover. So by splitting it apart, it's like, it's not that Mastodon is worse, even though it is worse, but it's that now we're not all in the same space. So when I want to find somebody to come on the podcast, but their Twitter is inactive, it kind of sucks, So I don't know. It's up to everybody what they want to do, obviously, but I feel like it hasn't fallen apart over there yet, and I don't know. It's weird how much everybody's.
It's weird how everybody is so into it. Like they love talking about Twitter. Like I know the irony of us talking about it right now, but it's like on the app itself. It's just funny how some people just log on to only talk about the app itself and not just use it for what it could be used for, right? It's a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Like you're making it worse by doing this, right? It's like if we just sort of pretend like
retweet of
it's really an interesting psychology around it.
No, but that's why I was glad to talk to you about it because
absolutely.
Are the most professional tweeter I know. So obviously everybody should go follow Patrick Tomaso over on Twitter, and I guess follow me too if you don't already.
Absolutely.
But thanks for coming back, Patrick. It's great to talk to you again.
Always a pleasure. Anytime.